Hello everyone. Today we are so honored to have Professor Ambassador James Bindernagel and Dr. Nguyễn Hùng Sơn to join with us today to discuss about the China rise and the policy options for small and medium countries, including Vietnam. So let me introduce something about our distinguished speaker today. Ambassador Bindernagel is the former ambassador of the United States to Germany, and now he is a thinker of the Boston Global Forums. And Dr. Nguyễn Hùng Sơn is a deputy director of the Institute for South China for the East Sea Studies and Diplomatic Academy. He comes from the MOFA. Okay, so first, I would like to start our online discussion today with an event that captured the world attention in recent months. That is the placement of the Chinese oil rig. And though the Chinese withdraw the oil rig and de-escalate the tension, someone say that the placement changed the world perception of China rise fundamentally. Do you agree with this comment?
Well, first of all, I don't know the world perception towards China, whether it has changed, but the region's perceptions towards China certainly has changed. Because out of a sudden, China has conducted a very assertive activity against one of its closest neighbor, which is supposed to be its comprehensive strategic partner. So the region and the world may wonder if China could do that to Vietnam, what could it do to other neighboring countries such as the Philippines, such as Japan, such as Korea, or ASEAN in general. And huge questions were raised on whether and how China is going to rise, whether it's going to continue to rise peacefully, whether it's going to seek peaceful solution to its disputes with its neighboring country, whether it's going to abide by the international law, whether it's going to be a responsible stakeholder as it rises. So there are huge uncertainties regarding China after the oil rig incident in the South China Sea.
How about you?
First, let me say I'm very pleased to be here and to join together with this conversation. It's a very important one, and it's very timely. For the Americans, with regard to China and its attitudes toward China, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs last year does regularly a survey of American attitudes in foreign policy. With regard to China, 69% of the Americans want to engage and engage peacefully with China. So there's an orientation that we have is to seek that peaceful rise that China has and has stated, and to encourage that, and to engage with China, because it's very, very important for the United States. With regard to the South China Seas, or as you might say, the East Sea, or we might say the Western Pacific, there are obviously critical issues that have been raised in terms of sovereignty over islands, over regional issues beyond the South China Seas in the Senkaku Islands regarding Japan. And so when you have these issues of sovereignty, it raises immediately the historical issue, the political issue of a rise of a major power. And a rise of a major power is normally seen with conflict and the counter reaction from another major power who is challenged. In our case, as I said, the United States, have tried very hard to engage peacefully and to support the peaceful rise of China. When the islands, the Senkaku Islands, were challenged by the Chinese, and the President of the United States came to Japan in April, he made it very clear that the United States covers the Senkaku Islands with the security arrangement with Japan. That eased the tension with the islands of the Senkaku Islands, but immediately then the Chinese effort to assert its national sovereignty over a region that is conflicted, not only with Vietnam, but with others in the region. And the China National Overseas Oil Company moved this rig into that disputed area. And it was a very clear sign that something was amiss, that something was being challenged. Now, it obviously raised tensions in the region, and raises for us then the question why? What is it that is motivating this? Now, there's several issues that could be possible. One is the stated rise of China, which Xi Jinping has made very clear that there are three questions, three hopes for China, and that fits in with their priorities. Obviously, with the Senkaku Islands, Taiwan, and the South China Seas as the China dream, as Xi Jinping puts it. So then the question is, well, why now? Why at that moment? And I would look to try to understand the dynamic inside China as well as an element of what is happening. So is it that with the priorities set by the national government in Beijing, that individual actors, such as the China National Overseas Oil Company or in the People's Liberation Army or others, can they have freedom to act? And try to understand more deeply that perhaps the China National Overseas Oil Company decided to move not necessarily at the direction of Beijing, but maybe under the priorities and maybe on their own. So it, for me, raises questions that allow us then not to predispose what the answer is, but to understand what the dynamic is, and gives us the ability to say to the Chinese and to the Vietnamese and to the Filipinos, particularly in the island discussions here and sovereignty issues, what are options? Not foreclosing what they are by deciding that this is an aggressive action that is somehow contained in an aggressive policy, but why? And ask those questions.
Yeah. So I pose this question because if we observe the Chinese activities in the East Sea, we call Vietnamese call East Sea. So please use that. Yeah.
Okay, I will use
this term. Yeah. So the East Sea, we found that if we look at in systematic way since 2007, that China is more and more assertive and aggressive in pursuing the territorial claims. And one Chinese scholar said that we can analyze the dynamics inside such activities, but it reveals one general pattern is that China is building up, formulating a new grand strategy. So we want to know more what characteristic of that grand new strategy that we can formulate, we can predict, and we can observe now. Yeah.
Well, certainly as China rises, it wants to have a better, higher status in the international stage. And one of the interpretation of the China's dream is that China would like to become a global leading superpower. And from what we observe from China's pattern of behavior, we could tell that China is heavily obsessed by what they see as a threat from the United States. And they would like to be able to counter that threat. And one of the China's dream is to be able to escape the threat from the United States and be on par with the United States. And from what we see, that interprets into China's naval dream to become a naval power in the seas. And to be able to become a naval power in the seas, China is increasingly investing into its naval military assets, and it's increasingly asserting its power at sea and asserting its claim both in the East China Sea and the South China Sea and what we call the East Sea. And according to some scholars, China has set its objective, maybe not directly from the top leadership, but from various groups of interests inside China, that maybe by 2021, by the 100 years anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, China would like to be able to sort of monopolize or to be able to fully control the water space within the first chain of island, down from Japan to Okinawa to Taiwan, Philippines, down to the South China Sea. And that is why China is undertaking several activities to assert their claims and to enhance their presence within this border of water. We are looking at the oil rig incidents, but that is not just one incident. We also have to be mindful of other incidences down south of the South China Sea, such as the land reclamation of several features in the Spratly areas of China's enhanced activities in the western part and eastern part of the South China Sea regarding the features which is under control by the Philippines as well. So looking at it systematically, we could see that although China may not have a strategy formulated by the top leadership or directed from the top leadership, but the top leadership supports the plan or the activities initiated by various groups within China. And that is the dangerous things, because they don't stop it. They don't undertake any activities to stop it, although they know that there's something wrong with it.
Son, I think that's a very wise analysis of where China is coming from. I think you point out strategically what has dramatically shifted from earlier times. And the Chinese have a history, a concern of the last 150 years of humiliation and colonialization and land issues, including the Vietnam War, we call, the American War, you call, the Korean War. That shift from their historical position in the land wars to what we have now, and that is really to turn to the sea, because the conflicts that we have now are not on land, they're on the sea. And then you look, I think very rightly, to what are the capabilities that are being developed. And not only the capabilities or the positioning of places around the Spratlys and the Scarborough Reef and others, but rather what they're doing also with the military buildup to support that, which then challenges the role of the United States. I think for us in the United States, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the United States' role is from the Chinese point of view, and perhaps from some of the neighbors, although that seems to be changing after the Chinese have been more, as you like to call it, more aggressive. The question of the United States, what is the role of the United States? First of all, if you take those land wars, both in Vietnam and in Korea, that was in the context of the Cold War. And so now the Cold War is over for 25 years. What's the role? So many analysts are looking at the United States as continuing the Cold War. We are not. That is finished. But the role of the United States is, first of all, we are a Pacific power. We have every right to be here. This is part of the United States' interest, and what we are trying to do is to maintain stability. I draw an analogy with the European experience. After the Second World War, the United States immediately withdrew from Europe and were challenged by the Soviet Union and came back. So did we come back in the Cold War sense to confront the Soviet Union? Yes, but we also did something that's really, I think, analogous to the debate that's happening here. We came in and supported the coal and steel community between the French and the Germans, who had, in the last 200 years, something like 24 wars with each other and were arch enemies and had no possibility of getting past that until they came up with the shared resources. Those resources they focused on were those resources that created war. So it's coal and steel. That's traditional things of war-making resources. In that analogy, if you go very fast through the history of the European Union to today, you now have almost 70 years with those countries involved in that project without conflict, without military conflict. On the periphery, of course, in Yugoslavia and now in Ukraine, there are things on the periphery that show that outside of that relationship of shared activity, shared single market and developing resources, and then doing some political cooperation, there is an opportunity to think about what is the way to approach the issue. That's the role of the United States in Europe. That is the role, essentially, what we've had in our mind of what our role is here, is to bring the parties together and to try to ensure that there is no conflict. The Europeans have perhaps not overcome the underlying political concern, which was nationalism in the 19th and 20th century. Although Mr. Putin has brought back the concept of nationalism. In East Asia, nationalism is a very strong force. It can be a strong force for good, because it rallies people to attend things, but it can be very out of control very quickly. And so nationalism is a motivating fact for us. We don't have nationalistic ambitions in East Asia, and we do play a role. And then the question becomes, under what structure? How do we do that?
So let me ask you one question from reader. As you mentioned about the United States, the U.S. role in the region, one reader sent a question that, do you think is this because of the U.S. soft handling toward China that emboldened the revisionist China power? So,
Lam, I think that's a good question, and I would immediately say no. Because what do you have in structural terms? The United States' relationship with bilateral security agreements with Japan and with Korea, the Republic of Korea, provide a structure around which the Chinese can make judgments and know what the reaction will be. So in the example I had with the Senkaku Islands, when the Chinese announced their air defense identification zone, and when they challenged the Okinawa prefecture borders, and the Japanese self-defense forces reacted by sending airplanes to challenge the Chinese. This was all very unstable and very difficult until the president and President Obama in April came out and said, no, the Senkaku Islands come under the structure of this agreement. The Chinese then, as I said earlier, moved. Well, the problem then is, what are the structures in the EC? What are where's the conflict resolution? Where can you judge what is the border? When do you want to call it provocative, or when your moves are not challenged? As is your point about we're not challenging them. Well, how can we do that? Can that be through structures around ASEAN? As ASEAN develops? Can it be in the Asia Summit? We've had in the United States a suggestion that the United States should become a strategic partner with Vietnam against China. That's not an approach one should take. That's confrontational without any resolution. So the question really is, what structures are possible so that both sides can not miscalculate, that they can understand where the borders are, where the limits are.
I quite agree with the questions of the reader. I think the U.S. has a critical role to play in keeping a stable and peaceful region. And there can be arguments both ways. Either the U.S. perceive weaknesses, which encourages China to become more assertive, or even the U.S. even strong-handed or the U.S. assertiveness, which provoked China to become more assertive. It can be arguments either way. However, I think that it's the ambiguity which is creating misperception within China that encourages China to miscalculate and take wrong or wrongly perceived actions. So I think I agree with you. It's the structure which is quite important, but the purpose of such a structure is to help clear the ambiguity and ensure stability in the region so as to create transparency in the region. One of the things that ASEAN does for the region, which helps everyone, is to help clear the ambiguity. We interpret and we clarify each and everyone's intention, objectives in the region, and bring everyone's together in order to try to create a kind of avoid the misperception which can lead to miscalculations, and miscalculations sometimes are strategically very dangerous. So that is the role of the structure, and that is the role of the ASEAN which is playing in the region.
So I would like to just emphasize that point that you've just made, which is miscalculation. And while historical analogies are sometimes difficult, I think in this 100th anniversary of World War I, that's the element that's very important. It's the miscalculation. It's not knowing. I mean, structures are helpful to make that happen, but it is the leadership of the countries that's critical to not make miscalculations, not make assumptions or test all your assumptions against what's going on, what you're doing here in this conversation.
Yeah.
What are the ways that you can understand what's actually happening? Is that oil rig an initiative of an interest group? And if we then say, no, it's actually driven by the leadership of Beijing. Well, these are two hugely different outcomes.
Yes.
And two different ways to deal with the issue. You can protest this, or you can protest China. I mean, it's the incident or the whole country. So very, very difficult. But remember that in 1914 ended up in an unmitigated disaster for Europe, because you lost the Tsarist Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the liberal democracy in the West, and the Turkish Empire ended. So empires can end with miscalculation.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe the risk is that Chinese leaders and the various interest groups, as Mr. Sun mentioned, the risk is that they may overestimate their power and strength and underestimate the response from the international community, right?
I think that's absolutely right. When you think about the role of the United States here and the perception of the bases that we have, or in the case of sending a few more soldiers to Australia, and having the reaction that this is a provocative issue, which you raised. For us, it wasn't a provocative issue at all. It was simply being there and being available to have freedom of the seas, the international regime that's there, to enforce and protect the prosperity that we have through trade, a whole range of issues that we were not being provocative, but we were accused of being provocative. So that's the misperception area from the other side.
Yeah. So let's see from the Chinese perspective. You know about the Chinese dream, and their argument is that China is an economic power, and they could be surpass the United States in the maybe 10 years, 20 years later. Every country want to benefit from economic ties with China. So why you oppose China dominance? Why? Oh, you want to benefit from economic ties with China, but you don't support, you don't welcome the China dominance. What they think that is a normal and natural demand. Yeah.
Well, let me see that nobody opposes China's rise. They might have some concern on how China rises, but I don't think there's anyone who is afraid or who doesn't expect China to rise. I think that's a common consensus in the region, that China is and is going to continue to rise, and that is fully expected. What is not expected is that in the course of its rise, it's going to change the rule of the game altogether, or it's going to change the status quo to the extent that nobody is going to know what the rules of the games are, or they unilaterally change the rules or the norms of the region that countries in the region are so accustomed to and are so supportive. And that essentially is the system of international relations created after the World War II. So I think on the one hand, countries welcome China's rise, especially an economically rising China, but on the other hand, they also have certain expectation on China as China rise, especially in the political and security field. And it's the common wisdom of the region that China is going to listen to the expectation of the international community and stay within the framework that they think is beneficial towards China as well.
I think that's a very good position to take to the next level, then make it concrete with the EC. There's been a debate or a negotiation on code of conduct for a long time. It's not going anywhere. That would be something that you could actually have an outcome, and you could develop those relationships that you have talked about, whether it's dominance by China or it's actually cooperation with China. So, and that particular, the code of conduct is really very important. Then you could turn to developing resources. The analogy I made with the coal and steel community in Europe, you have fishing, you have oil developments, you have areas that you could cooperate on. And in fact, if I understand the negotiation and the agreement on the Gulf of Tonkin with that area between Hainan and Vietnam, there is an example where the Chinese are willing to develop a relationship that is beneficial to both without being arrogant or overwhelming, dominant to the other. So those are examples that one should be having discussions out. How do we do that? Now, can the United States play a role in encouraging those? We certainly, I understand my government is actually doing that. I'm not in the government, but I understand they are. That's the kind of structural discussion that actually leads to the question of who's dominating. And we all understand that the name Middle Kingdom, Trung Quoc, is not between us and them, but between heaven and earth. And I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, I've learned here this past week that Vietnam also feels often that they're too close to China and not close enough to heaven. I'm not sure that that's right, but maybe that's a way to understand the question of dominance and where your position is. It's in flux.
Yeah.
We need a chance to talk about it rationally, but openly, without regard to hurting feelings, but just to try to understand and not miscalculate.
Yeah. You mentioned about what we call that the Middle Kingdom syndrome. That is the obsession not only in Vietnam but in many regional countries. Yeah.
I
But
studied Mandarin in college for only 1 year.
Okay.
That is a lasting understanding.
yeah.
And to understand that syndrome is very, very important to frame the way that you approach issues. And I am not an expert of China, but I have been in and out of China for years. And I understand that this is an opportunity. I mean, China does have grievances, and many of the grievances are clear for the last 150 years. But they're not only with the region in Southeast Asia. There are issues that they lost territory to the Russians in the 1890s, and the Western colonial powers. What I find interesting, because I am about to be the Henry Kissinger Professor at the University of Bonn, that the attitudes from China, as I understand, towards Germany is that same question. How did Germany, rising as it did 100 years ago, not to make the analogy with China, but rising 100 years, how did Germany itself have a disastrous 20th century, lose 2 world wars, and today has high standing, has a position in the world, is respected? How did that come about? Maybe there's some lessons that the Chinese could learn from the German case. Is respect for human dignity is the fundamental issue of the German Constitution and the way the Germans do it. Maybe there are lessons that could go beyond the region and globally, and perhaps we'll make some contribution in that discussion in the next year.
Yeah, okay. It's
And how
great.
did Japan rose after World War II and still
Yeah.
being accepted by the region?
Right.
It's also a good lesson.
Although that's also a mixed lesson, because in the question of nationalism, the motivating factor for nationalism, at least in Northeast Asia and in East Asia, is nationalism, and what the Japanese did in World War II that has not been accepted by those other two. And acceptance is very important to make the future as well. Remembrance is very important. What happened? We need to remember. We need to remember also the Vietnam War, how we came to that, why we did this. But we also need to move into the future. And how do we get there? And we don't do it by taking pieces of history and using them against peace.
Sure. We call it, we do not forget, but we do forgive.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I found that one of the lasting impressions I have in this week that I've been in Vietnam, that there's a very strong future orientation in here, and the people that I have met, remembering what happened, and speaking to an American that's also from that era. It's very interesting to see the openness and the willingness to look to the future. That's a good lesson for the others in Southeast Asia.